Thank you to the University of Chicago and everyone who helped make this come to life. And I appreciate everyone's time today, no matter where you are in the world. Thinking about Wunderkammer, Dr. Abe talk really is a great introduction to mine. And I too saw new things I hadn't seen before. So basically, I'm looking at how and why people collect it, who collected it, how did it get there, why did they collect it? So very basic questions about traditional when you're writing your paper, talking about or putting the exhibition together, how and why, and who, what, where, when, and why. Looking at a definition of exhibition, I think it is a spatial concern, like Professor Wu Hong said. It's looking at exhibitions in the private arena, such as private collectors. It's looking at private clubs and associations, their exhibitions. It's looking at public sales through auctions or dealers, but also public exhibitions through expos or exhibitions in museums, schools, and then public fairs. And so the big picture is looking at who, what, where, and why, and where they're happening, but also the idea of a Wunderkammer starting out in the 16th century is looking at things that are very curious, very different, and why one would want to collect. Looking at the screen here, you see something as mundane as today is a coconut shell or a nautilus shell or a quartz crystal really did mean something in the 17th century because it was so rare to have that. So there's a curiosity. There's a curiosity of finding something global, but it's also it's an imported rarity that you can define, collect, and show off. So that's an important aspect that is thinking about exhibitions. So it can be a very small private collection that you invite people to see, but it also can grow to be shared within a club with like-minded folks, and eventually moving towards a public display and public dissemination of knowledge, out of which one is writing the narrative. Looking at, going back a little bit in time, we're looking at a Rembrandt portrait from around 1650, an etching around 1657. And if we look at the left-hand side and look at the detail underneath, you see a Ming Dynasty a sculpture, effigy, a ceramic, or in wood and a ceramic. And I found a Ming Dynasty example on to the right. So there is this idea that the pieces are coming into 17th, 18th century, into Europe, being collected, but also being represented with their owners, but also reinterpreted in copies of that connection between the owner and the object, however that may be, how they were defining it to themselves. But it's definitely showing the Wunderkammer and how they are part of an elite group, I would say. Same thing here when we're looking at the idea of a global identity and knowledge growing with the expansion of trade around the world. We look at this 17th century painting by Van Kessel. He did ones of Asia, Africa, North America, South America. And that sort of global idea and creation of knowledge is not only in print and in actual objects, but also paintings of those objects. And I'd move forward to the center part of that large painting. The center, we see in the back, you see a Buddha figure, again, like Dr. Abe said, on a higher stand looking down. And then looking forward, we see that the painting also has one, it's a scroll painting of calligraphy rolled up. Behind it, I would argue that's a wrap for that scroll. And on top of that scroll, you'll see it's a last Ming, at the end of the Ming Dynasty, looking at a book, a treatise, and at the top of my slide there, you see the actual book in printing. And so the actual book had to be within reach of the artist to be able to correctly paint it, the characters, write the characters there, upside down in this painting, but still shows that connection of Wunderkammer plus knowledge, a global identity, plus displaying that actual object in its true form, but also extending that books are an important part of the collection and exhibition of East Asian art in the West. And we've all seen many, many still lifes, and looking at the detail of this Dutch painting from, you see that the bowls being showed off with everyday materials, and then a still life, and looking at the bowl themselves with the detail on the left, and then looking at the actual works on the right. The painter is seeing these objects up close and personal to be able to mimic the designs on the bowls themselves. So there is this idea of collecting, reinterpreting through painting to share that it is documented, but also that the objects are actually there and being used and available to the artist as well. I would also move forward to a famous Hogarth print, looking at the fair in the 18th century. It's a very boisterous day here. We see it in the courtyard here, and on the left-hand side, we see that there's a China dealer, often called Chinamen, in the sense of they deal in China, porcelain, but also here, running out the side door before the roof collapses upon her, I would say is a China woman dealing in Chinese porcelains and blue and whites, like we just saw in the slide before, with such as these blue and whites. Here's a fair selling them. So it's a pretty much a ubiquitous, by the mid 18th century, that blue and white wares are out in public. It is still a Wunderkammer, but this is a Wunderkammer for the fair, for the common people as well, I would say, versus people who are only in elite collectors that would have the money to buy during the early part of the 18th century versus moving towards the middle part of the 18th century. You can see there's this inundation of ceramics coming to the West at this time and reaching up to the several millions of blue and white wares coming into the West. So there is this idea of Chinese ceramics coming in, Japanese ceramics as well at this time because of the Dutch East India Trading Company. But here's a fine example that it is popular, but is also into the population as well, not just as one may argue sometimes with exhibiting in exhibitions and museums, it's an elite collector, but there is also the everyday collector as well. So thinking about how and why exhibits exist, looking at the idea of Wunderkammer, just looking at fairs and expos from 1851 onwards to 1890. There's about a dozen shows in Europe, North America, and Australia. And the idea is focused on many areas: agriculture, industry, fine arts, crafts, science, the best of new technologies. But then if we look from 1890 to 1949, it's well over 40, so almost 4 times the amount as in that same sort of 50-year period. So this exponential growth in exhibitions and expos helps set at least some frameworks of the multiplicity of having an exhibit, during which these expos, there would be art from and sculptures, and looking at how and when East Asian nations participated. As early as 1873, China and Japan are participating in Vienna, and 1893, Korea was in the Chicago Columbian Expo. So throughout my talk today, I'll always highlight, since we're at the University of Chicago talking today, the role of Chicago having these materials and exhibitions right down the street from the university. Thinking of how this is a global endeavor, I focused a lot on the London exhibition of 1935. So I've looked at the genesis often about the Burlington Fine Arts Club, which lends its name to the Burlington House, which housed the 1935-36 exhibition. So we can see Chinese and Japanese works of art as early as 1878. These are all their catalogs that are available that you can locate and see. Some are illustrated with a few works, some are just text from the 1870s all the way through 1915. So you can see the types of works that are being offered from, like I mentioned, prints and books are important alongside works of art, lacquer, metalwork, as well as traditional porcelains from China and Japan. So this really sets the field how a fine arts club, which is private, takes its cues from large expos, starts documenting what's there, what they're each collecting, and that competition among collectors produces catalogs within the private club to share with not only their own clientele, but also the general public. And so you see this idea of collecting and exhibiting and documenting, and started of even a sense of provenance and documentation. I wanted to bring up Duanfang. I've reached her published on him before. And Duanfang is important, member of the late Qing dynasty government. He is part of the imperial team that goes to the West, comes to America, goes to Europe, and he's traveling across the US from the West Coast to the East Coast by train. He ends up in Chicago, and he's seeing the Field Museum being built in its new current location, and he donates a sculpture. And on the back, it's not only has the Tang inscription at the top, at the bottom, it's a handwritten English inscription in ink by Duanfang. And he's talking about the remembrance of this historic stone is presented as a souvenir, and it gives the date during the Guangxu period. So there is this idea of exhibition as gift and exhibition as lineage, or I guess a reminder, a souvenir of his trip, but also how sculpture is the gift of Chinese art that will be on display. So it's not only documenting his time, but also back through time with the Tang Dynasty work itself. I also always like to echo, we're looking at things in the West, but it is a global affair. A.W. Barr works with Duanfang and other collectors around the Shanghai area and opens an exhibit in November of 1908. And it's old Chinese porcelains and works of art. And looking at how large it was, here's how it's displayed very orderly, like we've seen in Dr. Abe's slides about the Western displays, early displays in Paris. But here's one in 1908 in Shanghai, and it's about 3,000 pieces, which is, as we will see, this is a massive exhibition, second only to the 1935-36 show. But I'll use Duanfang as a person that's to follow through time of this presentation, but also Barr. So upon which, looking at expos in the West, Asia is also doing expos. Duanfang leads the Nanyang Industrial Exposition. It does have a fine arts building, but also agricultural examples. 13 nations participate. But if you look at traditional ideas and histories of expositions, Asia is usually left out. And so that's an important thing that I wish that in terms of exhibitions and this talk and our symposium today is to look at Asia as an active participant and active nations coming to China to participate in East Asian expos. So using Duanfang there, we think Duanfang's relationship to Barr and little known exhibits like this, the Montrose Gallery in New York City. We see there's 120 exhibits gathered by Barr. He's making a living by these exhibits. He's showing them and selling them in New York City. He works a few times with the Montrose Gallery in the early part of the 20th century. Here again, he's looking at pottery and at the Montrose Gallery, and here's an illustrated page from this. So the exhibit before, we have 120 exhibits. This exhibit 86. So there is a publication, there's documentation, it's a public sale, it's a public exhibition, and there's an academic sense of having the catalog and imagery and defining and starting to use the words that we are using today within our canons of East Asian art, but also how we talk about collections and displays. Moving forward from 1914, 1917, again, with the idea of highlighting the role of Chicago, the National Collection, which is the Freer Collection, came to Chicago. It had 117 exhibits as shown. It's a fairly rare catalog, but also thinking about how and why the history of Lang as a collector. So there's an institutionalization of his legacy during his lifetime and how much money and art he's giving to the nation. So this is very important about a Wunderkammer showing off private collections now coming to America, and a nationalized collection here in 1917 during the very tumultuous period in Europe with the First World War coming on board. But looking at what was there, 75 paintings, about only a few sculpture, but also more an addition of jades. So paintings outweigh sculptures and jades, but it also talks about a national collection that travels through the US, highlighted at the field, but also, at the Art Institute of Chicago, but that again reinforces the academic nature of how the exhibitions are moving forward at the beginning of the 20th century in America. So as mentioned, we have moving forward to looking at the going back to Europe, looking at Amsterdam in 1925, we see that these exhibits are starting to collect internationally. So you're loaning from private collectors, as I mentioned before. Private collectors across Europe are loaning their works to institutions, as in museums, or museums to groups that would found museums, and museums also loaning their collection. So you have a private partnership, you have a public partnership, and academic partnerships beginning here in Amsterdam. And just looking at the size of the catalogs, I'd like you to understand this. The one is they're very, very large. And these are this idea of publication of academics, but also art history in terms of how we're sharing and creating knowledge through the public word, a published word is quite important. And then again, looking at the number of exhibits and who loaned, about 212 works, and private and public collection. The next year, we're looking at 1926, 600 works from several countries in East Asia and South Asia. And looking at, it's one of the first post-World War I exhibits with international loans from now dealers, museums, and individuals. We see Eumorphopolis coming up again, whose great works went to museums in London, but also works from France, museums, and we know Guimet and Czerniawski are now private collections, now public collections, public displays. And so documenting that growth of 212 exhibits the year before, now we have 600. We also want to look also alongside how public displays and sales are happening. And I argue that auction houses are public displays and exhibitions of art. And here we have Otto Burkhardt from Germany. He's an art dealer, starts off being the first Dada art dealer in Germany. He moves to East Asian art. He's back and forth Berlin to Peking or Beijing. And his public sale at an auction in 1928 had 222 lots. But also that same year from 1928, we see that 3 years later in 1929, the Cologne exhibit said, hey, wait a minute, we also want to produce a new catalog, and here we have a view of their exhibition. So exhibits are published and have a life of their own, re-documenting their establishment of exhibitions and narrative and how they displayed the art. So that idea of postmortem publication about the publication itself by Alfred Salmony, as a name we're going to see come up again and again in my presentation, is one of the few exhibits that I saw that was able to produce a catalog, take a break, come back and produce another catalog. So twice the effort to document in an academic setting, but also how they exhibited the arts. 1929, we're seeing this Chinese art exhibit in Berlin. It's a smaller size catalog, but it has over 1,200 exhibits. And we see, again, 171 institutes, private and institutional collections, and a global reach of 13 countries. So we're seeing growth, academic work, and documentation, but also this sort of support helps establish not only museums, but also societies for the study of Chinese art in Germany. So we're seeing this combination of private, public, plus state government, plus how to document, and that intertwining we will see is continues of dealers alongside scholars, alongside museums, alongside private collectors. One of the most famous, of course, we've seen in Chinese art, and as a dealer would be C.T. Liu. It's important that know that Alfred Salmony is working with Liu and helping produce catalogs. And he's also one of the scholars who departs Germany and goes to Vassar, for example, as one of the liberal arts schools that was taking scholars from Europe and teaching Asian art in America at an early time. But he also is part of this Asia as editor-in-chief. And so this relationship he has with Liu will be very important to not only promote the sale and collections from Liu, but also establishing Salmony as an expert. And also he is helping create the early canons from the 1930s onwards through the 50s. We saw Burkhardt before selling at will, but now here in 1935, in Germany, his collection is sold on demand. His artwork is acquired by the state of Germany and sold. And these two exhibit catalogs have over 1,390 lots, and it has several sale dates. So they're exhibited and sold, printed and published, and with illustrations and descriptions. So even in thinking about exhibitions, we have to think how and why are exhibitions shown. This one's before Bouckaert is on purpose, but now it's on demand, and it's taken by the state and sold to benefit the state. And these artworks are illustrated and documented like a traditional auction catalog and displayed in the same way for the public to see, but this is a different way to see it in an exhibition as liquidation. Leading up to the 35-36 show, at the same time periods as Bouckaert's things are being taken by the state and sold, we have the development of the largest exhibition of Chinese art ever. It begins its life in Shanghai, if we remember, akin to where Barr had his first exhibit of 3,000 works. And beginning of this show was exhibited in Shanghai for just under a month. We have a set of 4 bilingual catalogs, and looking at how and why these are shown. Important to note that how they are looking in terms of percentages, but also what it's important, they are showing the academic work of archaeologists, and 20% of volume 4, which is under miscellaneous, describes the works happening by Chinese archaeologists and standardization of economic and science in the field of archaeology, which informs exhibitions. And we look at the largest show here in 1935-36 with the gallery reviews, 2 sets of catalogs, and the commemorative one and the actual one there on the left for the everyday catalog versus the commemorative one. We had almost 500,000 visitors, hundreds of thousands, over 100,000 sold, and 3,080 exhibits, and over 240 lenders. So we see an exponential growth from the 20s to the 30s, from 200 works to 3,000 works on display. And looking at the catalogs, Duanfang is noted 25 years after his death within the exhibition. We see him here with his famous works at the Met, but in the 35-36 show, this is a list of museums that tout that they have works from Duanfang. So thinking about World War II is coming up in world history. The Burlington House had slated a great exhibit of Japan and a great exhibit from Germany. These were both, if you look in the footnotes of their annual documentation, we're looking at how and why artworks and exhibitions can be canceled because of international issues. And looking at New Zealand, which is often overlooked in Western art studies for Chinese art, about 360 works there. And the idea of Salmoni's work is, and Liu working together, the Ordos bronzes exhibited here are part and documented as notes in the entries. In terms of exhibitions, after coming up to World War II, we're looking at how at the Arden Gallery, it's a gallery selling works, but these works are collected by majority of women, and they're working with the Chinese government here with Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and as well as Theodore Roosevelt's wife. And looking at, again, the Chicago collection of Creel, Professor Creel looking at bronzes, female women scholars and collectors being published in this catalog. And the collectors here of bronzes being women is quite rare to understand in terms of exhibition of art. These works can be cited back to works in Yale, and also the idea of women as collecting of paintings, which the Moore collection. And I would end here because I know I'm running out of time. As in Germany, the Yamanaka collection was taken over by the US government and it's sold. And that's just the idea of thinking about how and why things are exhibited and how and why they're sold helps us understand not only the spatial concerns, but how these things become part of collections that we still look at today, but not knowing how and why they originally exhibited can hinder how we think about moving forward. So we should always think about the past, who, what, where, why, how things were collected, but also how they're exhibited. So I'll end here, and I thank you all for your time.